Hello and welcome to the 10th lecture podcast for the Sheridan College General Education Elective, Canada in the Making, Understanding Canadian History. In this 10th podcast, we're going to be looking at the role of Canada in the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. We're also going to get a taste at what came afterwards, the beginnings of the Cold War and Canada's role in the post-war world. All that to come today on Canadian History. The learning outcomes for this lecture podcast are: number 1, understand the basic narrative of World War II. Number 2, identify Canada's military and economic role in World War II. Number 3, describe the Holocaust and its connection to the Second World War. And finally, number 4, assess the beginnings of the Cold War. So in 1939, the world found itself once again on the brink of a global conflict. For only the second time in human history, the entire world would be dragged into war between 1939 and 1945. World War II would be, and remains to this day, the most destructive war in history. If we include civilians, approximately 75 million people were killed. Now, I know about 2 lecture podcasts ago, I described the Great War, or World War I, as being, to that point, the most destructive conflict that humankind had ever known. But the Second World War is so much bigger. It dwarfs it by comparison. It makes it seem like a minor squabble in comparison. In World War I, approximately 21 people, if we include civilians, died. When you compare that to 75 million, well, there's just no comparison at all. For Canada, approximately 45,000 of our soldiers would be dead and 55,000 wounded. The Second World War would also be the first and only human conflict where nuclear weapons would play a role. You see a picture here of the mushroom cloud rising over the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. This was one of 2 nuclear bombs dropped on the Japanese by the Americans, effectively ending World War II. So in this lecture podcast, I'm going to talk about how World War II happened. I'm also going to talk about what made it so different than the conflicts that had come before, and how it shaped the Western world, and Canada in particular, in many, many different ways. One major change in the Second World War compared to the First World War is, in many countries, women for the first time were now serving in uniform in the war. This is very different from the First World War, where women were pretty much restricted to being only nurses. That was the only real role open to them. But in the Second World War, women actually served in a variety of roles within the Army, the Air Force, the Navy. For example, in Canada, 55,000 women served across the Canadian Royal Navy, the Army Corps, the Air Force, and the nursing sisters as well. This is a rare color image. Of course, that's another thing about World War II. We have color photography. This is a rare color image of women who were part of the Auxiliary Territorial Service at the Coastal Artillery Headquarters in Dover, England, from December of 1942. Once again, Europe would be nearly destroyed by the fighting during World War II. But it wasn't just in Europe. The war would be fought all around the world once more. This would be a war where airplanes would play a greater role than ever before. Here you see an image of RAF fitters changing the engine of a Lockheed Hudson at Sheridan in the Gambia in April of 1943. And here's an image of Lancaster bombers nearing completion in Avro's assembly plant at Woodford in Manchester in 1943. Tanks, which were only first invented in the First World War and played a really limited role in that war, would now be more important than ever before. Here's an image of a Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tank in action in August of 1944. World War II would be the ultimate clash of civilizations. On one side, the free democratic world rallied to stop Hitler, who wanted to institute his Third Reich, which was the official name that the Nazis gave to Germany under Hitler's leadership. The Third Reich, the idea being that the first empire was the Holy Roman Empire during the Middle Ages. The second empire was the empire instituted under Otto von Bismarck and the Kaiser with German unification, and now the Third Reich being under Hitler. The underside of the war would see untold human misery and cruelty and the murdering of over 6 million Jewish people by the Nazis and many others too. The principal consequences of World War II would be the end of European world dominance. Europe would be so devastated by the end of World War II that it would no longer be the principal controller of the world. And in fact, it would also lead to decolonization in much of the rest of the world, as Europeans find it impossible to keep up their former empires. In decolonization, we also see the spread of mass society to the rest of the world. And in the ashes of World War II, we see the redistribution of world power between two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, and the beginning of the Cold War. In terms of the two sides of the conflict in World War II, it looks very similar to World War I. On one side, we have the Allied powers made up of Britain and France and the Commonwealth countries, including, of course, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. China is also on the Allied power side. Joining the fight later on in the war, in 1941, which we'll see was a major turning point in the war, the USSR, or the Soviet Union, which is what Russia had begun calling itself after the Russian Revolution, which, if you recall from the World War I lecture, that had happened in the last year of World War I. And the United States also would join the war effort in 1941. And when these two countries joined the war effort, and we'll explain why they did, that really would be a turning point in the war. On the Axis powers side, we have Germany, and then this time we have Japan and Italy. Both of those countries had actually fought on the Allied side in World War I, but in World War II they would be on the Axis power side. And then we also have Hungary. One way to understand how the Second World War gets started is to think of it as two separate local conflicts that grow in size and then eventually join up together, creating a huge global conflict. Well, one of those local conflicts was a conflict that was brewing in Asia. And the other one, of course, is a conflict that we'll be talking about in a moment, which was brewing in Europe. And these two conflicts would grow in size and eventually lead to World War II. So let's talk about the Asian conflict first. So in Asia, we have the country of Japan and the country of China, the two sort of main powers in this region at the time. Now, the thing is that the countries had really been affected by the Industrial Revolution differently. Japan in the late 19th century had undergone a complete revolution of its culture and its economy. Historians refer to it as the Meiji Restoration. And what it meant is that Japan basically rapidly transformed itself into a modern industrial power. By the time World War I came along, Japan was participating in the war and contributing, almost to the same degree that one was expecting of other Western countries. And then by the time we get to World War II, Japan is arguably one of the most powerful countries in the world from a military standpoint, which is a remarkable transformation. And of course, this is all to do with the transformative power of the Industrial Revolution. We talked about the Industrial Revolution and how it had affected Canada a few lectures ago. Well, it was affecting countries all around the world. But not all countries were participating in the Industrial Revolution to the same extent. China, on the other hand, was very slow to industrialize. China's population remained relatively rural at this point in time. So in comparison to the Japanese population, which was becoming heavily urbanized, China's population was not. Japan was smaller, and that meant it was easier to connect its urban centers with rail networks, which of course would accelerate production of material goods and the Industrial Revolution as a whole. So what this creates is a major power imbalance in the Asian sphere. Japan is very quickly becoming a massive power in the region, and China, despite its large geographic size and large population, is not. And that sort of imbalance is creating the tension because, of course, Japan is becoming increasingly ambitious. Japan wants to create an empire in the South Pacific. And so in pursuit of these aims, in 1931, Japan invades the region of Manchuria, which is today that region is part of China. It's north of Korea. And arguably, this invasion in 1931 is what sort of starts the Second World War. Now, normally we don't think of the Second World War starting as early as 1931. Usually we talk about the Second World War beginning in 1939. But if we just think about it in terms of when did the fighting start and when did it end? Well, the fighting started in Asia in 1931, and it would not stop until the war finally comes to an end in 1945. So yes, in 1931, we don't have a global conflict yet. We have a localized conflict, but it is the first shots fired of a conflict that would spread and eventually become the global conflict we know as World War II. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper, and here's where we really see the Asian conflict beginning to spin out of control and grow in size and in importance. So if this is what's happening in Asia, let's now turn to Europe and see what was going on there. So how does war get going in Europe? Well, to understand that, we have to turn to Italy and the rise of this man, Benito Mussolini, and his new political movement, which he called fascism. So what is fascism, first of all? Because it's often used incorrectly in a modern context. When historians are talking about it, they're really talking about this movement that Mussolini started. It was a type of political organization, a way of organizing a country's economy, its military, its culture, all under the control of a single leader. His version of fascism would be incredibly popular. It would spread not just from Italy, but it would be adopted in slightly different form in Germany under Hitler and the Nazi Party, and it would be adopted in Spain and a few other places. Fascism is normally associated with the far right of the political spectrum, but in many ways, it actually borrows elements from both the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the political spectrum, if you know what I mean by the left and the right sides of political spectrum. So in terms of the right side, it employed sort of an authoritative leader, an ultra-nationalism. So it was, the strong belief that we all have to be patriotic citizens of our country. It's characterized by dictatorial power, and suppression of opposition parties. So anyone who disagrees with the leader and the government is going to be suppressed. On the left side of the political spectrum, though, it often adopts a direct control of the government of the economy, nationalizing major industries of the country, a strong regimentation of society and of the economy as a whole. And so in many ways, then, it's difficult to categorize because we don't really have a direct equivalent per se in the modern context the same way it existed back in the 1920s and the 1930s. So it arises under the terrible post-war conditions that Italy experienced after World War I. So if you recall, Italy actually was on the winning side of World War I. It had been part of the Allied side, but Italy was a small country, and it couldn't contribute too much, and it didn't really have much of a voice at the bargaining table when, the Treaty of Versailles was signed after World War I. And the economy in Italy after the war really tanked. It was pretty rocky. Now, of course, the economy everywhere had a dip after the First World War, but after a period of time, it roared back. That's why we call it the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s boom. But that didn't happen to the same extent in Italy. And it was under those conditions that this man, Benito Mussolini, who was a politician, and became incredibly popular. He was good public speaker, that gave him the opportunity to rise to power. So he was elected in the beginning. As all fascist leaders are in the beginning, he actually used democracy, and he became the Prime Minister of Italy in 1922. But, as is characteristic of fascist leaders, he then dismantled democracy once he became in power. So he suppressed any opposition to his rule. He, basically started to control the press and anything that would be essentially become a mouthpiece of the government. And from 1925 onward, he essentially is a dictator. Another element of fascism that was defined under Mussolini but becomes typical of all other fascist governments, and that is that all control really becomes centered under one person, under a leader, who becomes almost a cult-like figure who is adored by the masses. So in Italy, Benito Mussolini becomes known as El Duce, the leader. And there's a picture or a photograph of El Duce in every single classroom across Italy. So you can imagine children beginning their day by pledging allegiance to El Duce, to the leader. Fascism also typically orients itself as an association with the military. So the leaders of fascist movements often are dressed in military dress. So here you see an example. There's Mussolini waving to the crowds, and he's wearing his, military uniform. And he was incredibly popular, and his movement called fascism was incredibly popular. Despite the fact that people were losing freedoms, Mussolini seemingly single-handedly was able to turn things around in Italy. Suddenly the economy got better. Suddenly it felt like Italy's confidence had returned and its ambition had returned. And as Mussolini rebuilt the Italian military, he began to flex some of those newfound muscles. So Mussolini ordered the Italian army to invade Ethiopia in 1935. Why? Because he could, really. I mean, because Ethiopia was ripe for the taking. And this was really his first aggressive movement. It certainly wouldn't be his last. And if you recall, I actually discussed this really briefly in the previous lecture podcast, where I talked about Canada's reaction to this, that, initially many countries around the world were condemning Mussolini and the Italian government for doing this aggressive action. But then Mackenzie King, because he didn't want to rock the boat too much, had actually softened Canada's response to it. So this is the context under which Benito Mussolini is coming to power. However, his idea of fascism would spread beyond Italy, and it would spread to Germany. And that's really where we start to see it take on a different form under Adolf Hitler. So if Italy was in a bad place after World War I, Germany was even worse. So Germany, of course, had been on the losing side of the First World War. Not only that, but its its co-teammates, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had effectively ceased to exist after World War I. So really it's Germany standing alone, holding the ball when the game came to an end. And the victors, the winning countries, particularly Britain and France, really wanted to make Germany pay. They wanted to exact revenge on Germany. And that really is why the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the First World War, is seen by many as an overtly punitive document, meaning that it essentially blamed Germany for the entire war, even though, as we saw when I talked about World War I a couple of lecture podcasts ago, the beginning of World War I is really complex, and it's certainly, you can't just blame it on one country. But the Treaty of Versailles essentially did that. It said, Germany, you are the one at fault. And so because Germany was at fault, there has to be a price to pay. And so Germany was forced to pay these massive reparation payments to the victor countries. And so, Germany then, in addition to experiencing the same economic depression that all countries around the world initially felt after World War I, Germany suddenly also had to pay these massive payments. And this essentially meant that Germany did not experience the Roaring Twenties at all. Things were in terrible state in Germany. We started to see things like hyperinflation, where the currency was effectively worthless. And then the Great Depression hit. And this, of course, just was the icing on the cake in terms of the situation in Germany. Now, it's in these conditions that a new political party, the Nazi Party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which emerged after the war, essentially became incredibly popular under a new charismatic leader known as Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler was really inspired by what Benito Mussolini had been doing in Italy. And he modeled his version of the Nazi Party and his version of fascism after Mussolini's fascists. So here again, you see Hitler in military dress, associating himself with the military, just like in Italy, the leader becomes a figure of adoration and all power is centered under the leader. The same thing happens in Germany. So it's der Führer, the father, who is now, school children are going to be pledging their allegiance to in the morning. The one element of Hitler's version of fascism, which doesn't really exist to the same extent in Mussolini's version of fascism, is anti-Semitism. So Germany already had a lot of anti-Semitic elements. So this is anti-Jewish beliefs, sort of racism against Jewish people. And Hitler and the Nazi Party, it was one of their pillars, basically, was a strong belief in anti-Semitism, a belief that Jews were the root of all of Germany's problems. And so this became one of the major planks that Germany, that the Hitler and the Nazi Party used to come to power, blaming the situation in Germany on Jews or Jewish leaders who had given everything away during World War I. That's what they would say. And so this becomes one of the central defining characteristics of Hitler's version of fascism. But in both Italy and in Germany, we see this new political movement coming to power, and we see seemingly overnight the country transformed. So Hitler, like Mussolini, was able to resurrect the German economy. He stopped making those reparation payments and many other things, as we'll see, and Germany begins to become ambitious and aggressive once more. So Hitler also had his territorial ambitions too. Remember the concept of Lebensraum, which means living space. And Hitler certainly intended to increase German territory. Now, some of that territory he intended to regain what was lost during World War I and arguably was taken away from Germany unfairly. But he also had his eye on other parts of Europe which had never been part of Germany before. And the rest of Europe and the world, we have to understand that nobody wanted to have a war again. So there was a reluctance to confront Hitler in some of these ambitions because World War I had been so terrible. So many people had died. And also there was an understanding that, the Treaty of Versailles had been somewhat unfair to Germany, and so we should be flexible to some degree or another in order to prevent war and maintain world peace. This would bring about the idea of appeasement. So appeasement is most commonly associated with the man on the left, who was the British Prime Minister. His name was Neville Chamberlain. So Neville Chamberlain had many meetings with Adolf Hitler over the years in the lead up to World War II. And he tried to do everything he possibly could to avoid a war taking place. Appeasement essentially means that they kind of let Hitler get away with certain things with the understanding that Hitler wouldn't take it too far, and that if he did, then we would be back at war again. And nobody wanted that. So they were going to try everything they could to avoid getting us into a major conflict. But Hitler would certainly begin to push the boundaries. So one of the first ways that Germany began to increase its territory was with the Saar. So the Saar was a small territory that at the end of World War I had been separated from Germany. It's that little area in red. And France was given control of its Saar mines. In 1935, there was a referendum of whether Saar wanted to be rejoined with the German territory. The territorial status referendum took place on January 13, 1935, and over 90% of the Saar voters opted for reunification with Germany. And the rest of the world, when this happened, France was not pleased with it, but at the same time they thought, well, the Saar used to be part of Germany, and so we really should just let this take place, and so everyone just kind of let it happen. So this is the first territorial acquisition of Germany. It wouldn't be the last. So the next thing that Hitler did was he focused on rebuilding the German military. One area of Germany, the Rhineland. At the end of World War I, the Rhineland, it's this area in yellow here by the Rhine River, had come under the occupation of the Allied forces. In the Treaty of Versailles, German military presence was forbidden from all territory west of the Rhine and within 50 kilometers east of the Rhine. And this was later reaffirmed with the Locarno Treaties of 1925, that this would be a permanently demilitarized zone. In 1929, however, Germany began to negotiate the withdrawal of Allied forces from the land, and the last Allied soldiers left the Rhineland in 1930. Following the Nazis coming to power in 1933, Germany began working towards rearmament and the militarization of the Rhineland. The reason why they wanted Germany not to have soldiers there is because it's right on the border of Belgium. This is where so much fighting had taken place during World War I. And then in 1936, Hitler finally broke all those treaties and ordered 3,000 German troops to move into the Rhineland. Now, this was celebrated in Germany because they just loved the idea that Hitler was standing up to the Allied powers. What did the Allied powers do? Well, kind of nothing. Nobody wanted war, and a lot of people argued, well, is it fair to say that Germany can't have military in its own land? Was that really fair? And so they didn't do anything. And here you see German troops marching into the Rhineland in 1936, and the people all happy and ecstatic. You see women giving the soldiers flowers. So from the German point of view, this was a celebrated moment, a moment where they were standing up to the Allied powers. They were getting back some of their dignity after World War I, and the rest of Europe kind of nervously sat on their hands and hoped against hope that this would be the end of Hitler's ambitions. Again, this is all about appeasement. At the time, they wanted to avoid war. However, Hitler's next move was much more provocative. In 1938, Hitler marched his troops south and annexed the country of Austria. The Austrian government fled, and this was a major provocation. Now, however, most of the people in Austria welcomed the Germans when they came. Hitler was a popular figure. He was seen to be someone who had turned the German economy around, and the Austrian government was not very popular at the time. And the rest of the world nervously watched as Hitler annexed this whole country. And what did they do? They didn't do anything because they thought, well, Austria is filled with German-speaking people, so yeah, maybe Germany and Austria being together, that's not such a big deal, I guess. Besides, we really don't want war. And here you see cheering crowds in Vienna, Austria, as the Germans come in and the Nazis take over. Again, generally speaking, in Austria, people liked it. Watch The Sound of Music for this period of history being depicted. So next, Hitler turned his attention to a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. So the Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia that was essentially filled with German people, German-speaking people, and people who were culturally German. The reason why it was part of Czechoslovakia was because of the reorganization after World War I. Originally, the Sudetenland had been part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, but after that disintegrated, it was given to the new country of Czechoslovakia. At this point when Hitler was making motions towards the Sudetenland, obviously the Czechoslovakians didn't like it, but we still had the same situation that the rest of Europe really didn't want war. And, certainly the argument would have been made, well, yes, it's not part of Germany, but it's part of Czechoslovakia, but it is filled with German-speaking people, so maybe we can all look away while he takes that, maybe. But things were getting serious. It was quite clear to everyone that Hitler was on, a shopping spree of territory around Germany, and this really had to come to an end. So our friend Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, met with Adolf Hitler another time in 1938. And his goal this time was try to get Hitler to agree to stop gobbling up more territories in Europe and hurtling the world towards war. No representatives from Czechoslovakia were brought in to have a say in what became known as the Munich Agreement of 1938. But in that agreement, and this is the pinnacle of appeasement, in that agreement, Hitler agreed that he would stop any more territorial acquisitions in return for the Sudetenland. He said, okay, look, I know that I annexed Austria. I know that, we got the Saar in a referendum, and I know I started remilitarizing the Rhineland, but I promise, honest to goodness, that this is it, that the Sudetenland is the last thing I'm going to take. And Neville Chamberlain shook hands with him, and that was the agreement. And of course, we all know that this didn't end well. So despite the fact that Czechoslovakia really didn't like this idea, they didn't want to give up their territory willingly, the fact that the rest of the world did not want to go to bat for them meant that there was nothing they could do. They just had to accept the Munich Agreement, and Hitler was able to ride into the Sudetenland without even firing a shot. And like he had in other places, this was largely German-speaking peoples, and he was very popular amongst German-speaking peoples, and so he was meted by adoring crowds, like what you see here in September of 1938. So obviously, lots of things have happened over the past 5 years, and Europe has done everything they can to try to avoid war, led by Neville Chamberlain and this policy of appeasement, which is they've been trying to appease Hitler. So Neville Chamberlain announced the results of the agreement to the rest of the world, and hoping that this would be the end of German territorial expansion.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Of course, as we know, Hitler had no intention of stopping there. He had every intention of continuing on. So, in order to start to make real preparations for the inevitable war that was going to follow, Hitler made some alliances. So first, he made an alliance with his buddy Mussolini. And why not? Mussolini and Hitler were both fascists. They liked to talk about fascist things. And although in private, Hitler considered Mussolini a bit of an idiot and didn't really respect him that much, in May 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel, uniting them in an alliance. The final chess piece that Hitler needed to put into place before he began his next move was to make a secret agreement with the Soviet Union, with Joseph Stalin. This was achieved with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act in 1939. This pact essentially would divide up the country of Poland between the two countries, because that was going to be Hitler's next move. He was planning on invading Poland. So here you see Poland is right between the Soviet Union and Germany. So clearly, had Germany just invaded Poland without the Soviet Union's agreement, that would have almost certainly provoked war between the two countries, which Hitler wasn't quite ready to have happen. Now, I think Hitler realized that going into Poland was probably a bridge too far. After all of those other arguments were based on the idea that, there were German people there and it made sense for Germany to absorb German-speaking people. But in Poland, there are Polish-speaking people, and it really, there's no excuse other than pure territorial ambition, which would cause Germany to want to invade Poland. And indeed, this was all about Lebensraum. That means, more living space for German people. And Germany, against the agreement that he had made with the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, invaded Poland in September of 1939. And this was it. This was the final straw. The rest of the world finally got off their hands and decided they had to do something about Hitler. So here you see German troops parading through Warsaw after the invasion of Poland. This time, no cheering crowds. Things are starting to get nasty.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it. He had evidently made up his mind to attack Poland whatever happened. And although he now says he put forward reasonable proposals which were rejected by the Poles, that is not a true statement. The proposals were never shown to the Poles, nor to us. And though they were announced in the German broadcast on Thursday night, Hitler did not wait to hear comments on them, but ordered his troops to cross the Polish frontier the next morning. His action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. And we in France are today, in fulfillment of our obligations, going to the aid of Poland, who is so bravely resisting this wicked and unprovoked attack upon her people. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
So after that sad speech, the United Kingdom was officially at war with Germany. Well, Canada would follow soon after, but there was a difference. In the First World War, Canada did not yet have any power over foreign affairs. It really only had autonomy over its domestic affairs. And so when the United Kingdom went to war, all of the Commonwealth countries were effectively dragged along in that conflict, whether they liked it or not. However, things were different this time. The Statute of Westminster, which had passed in 1931, had given Canada the right to control its own external affairs. And so, although there was some debate after Britain declared war on Germany whether Canada was still automatically at war because they had declared it on behalf of the monarch, which of course is the monarch as well of Canada. The Prime Minister Mackenzie King said, no, Parliament must decide. And so 4 days after the United Kingdom declared war, there was a special session of Parliament called, and after 2 days of debate, they voted in Parliament to approve a declaration of war. The only person actually who voted against it was the CCF leader, J.S. Woodsworth, but everyone else voted for the war declaration. And on September the 10th, 1939, Canada was officially at war with Germany. In time, Canada would also be at war officially with Italy by June of 1940, and Japan would follow in 1941 as all the dominoes begin to fall and we move into a full global conflict. With the beginning of war, this time the government was ready. They immediately passed the War Measures Act. So if you recall, the War Measures Act was a law, a temporary law that was passed during the First World War, and it gave the government extraordinary powers. It allowed the government to suspend civil liberties. It allowed the government to imprison in camps people that it deemed enemy aliens, or people who, they were worried about whether, because of their ancestry or whatever, that they would be not loyal to Canada. Well, it gave the government the right to just put them all in prison. It also gave the government extraordinary powers to control the economy, suppress information, take over factories, get them building whatever was needed for the war effort. So once again, Canada passed the War Measures Act, and Ottawa was going to put it to use during the war. Canada at the time only had about 11 to 12 million people, and yet over the course of the war, 1.1 million Canadians would serve in the war. So that's actually an extraordinary amount if you think about it. It's approximately 10% of the population would serve directly in the war effort. So for such a small country, it was an outsized contribution. And actually, of course, what is different as well is that 50,000 women this time around would also serve in the army. So Canada also had a couple of different major contributions to the war effort, in addition to simply just sending soldiers. One of them was to train all of the pilots and associated people needed for the air forces of all of the Allied powers. This was known as the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. It trained Allied crews, and by the end of it, 131,000 crewmen and women were trained between 1939 and 1945. Canada had 102 schools across the country, 184 auxiliary units, and 231 sites, all operating to basically train and turn out all of these air crews. This led the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, to refer to Canada as the aerodrome of democracy. Another major element that Canada participated in the war effort was the moving of manufactured aircraft from North America into Europe. So particularly aircraft that had been built in the United States, we needed to get it closer to the war front. But this is before aircraft could just routinely fly straight across the Atlantic. In fact, prior to the beginning of the war, only about 100 aircraft had actually attempted to cross the North Atlantic, and only about half of them had been successful at it. Yet, by developing new radar systems manned by Canadian crews, the ferry command system, as it became known, essentially created a leapfrog system where airplanes manufactured in North America would be transferred first to Greenland, then to Iceland, then to Great Britain, and later they would be taken directly across the Atlantic. And the success of this plan essentially also heralded the coming of the commercial aviation industry and the idea that transatlantic flights eventually will become the norm. Well, it begins here during World War II with Canada's participation in the ferry command system. So at the outbreak of World War II, Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, had a number of challenges. There were lessons that had been learned with what had happened with the conscription crisis and the huge division that it created between English and French Canada during the First World War. So first of all, Mackenzie King, as Prime Minister of Canada, was responsible for making sure that Canada would conduct a successful war effort. But on top of that, he was very much concerned with maintaining national unity. Because of all of the problems from the First World War, he didn't want to see that repeated. And so at the beginning of the war, he made a promise not to impose conscription. And in fact, really, Mackenzie King and his government were hoping to conduct what might be thought of as a war of limited liability, meaning that they didn't want actually it to affect Canada too much. Yet the pressures of the war were very quickly building up. The early part of the war did not go well for the Allies whatsoever at all. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that in just a moment, just how badly the war was going for the Allied side. But it did force King's government to make some further changes. So although he had promised against conscription, he compromised a little bit when his government passed the National Resources Mobilization Act, or the NRMA, in 1940. Now, what this act did is it required all men of a certain age to register for military service, and it also allowed the government to essentially acquire property and to force men of a certain age to participate in home defense and training. Even if they weren't going to be sent overseas, they at least had to spend some of their time training in military affairs so that they, in theory, could defend the home country. It also restricted the ability of men of a certain age from accepting civilian jobs in industries that were considered not essential to the war effort. So it's not quite conscription, but it's moving towards conscription. So from the point of view of Mackenzie King, it was a politically smart move because he was able to a certain extent, appease people who were calling for conscription and calling for Canada to have a bigger role in the war. But it also held off a little bit those who were firmly against the idea of conscription. Now, unfortunately, Mackenzie King would have to go back on his promise against conscription a little bit later into the war, and some of those men who had been trained for home defense would ultimately be sent overseas as well. At the beginning of the war, this was seen as a political compromise that would keep the peace. So the early part of the war did not go well at all for the Allied forces. Germany had an initial wave of success, and part of this was because of the strategy that Hitler and the Nazis adopted at the beginning, which was something they called the Blitzkrieg Strategy. The Blitzkrieg Strategy was using a huge army of basically all tanks, which could move incredibly quickly across the countryside, and then coupled that with air support. This allowed the Germans to, within 6 weeks, defeat France in 1940. So here you see Hitler walking through occupied Paris with the Eiffel Tower in the background. So it just was not going very well at all. At the same time, Germany began a campaign of bombing British cities. The Blitz would actually turn London into rubble, and people would be forced to spend their nights in the subway system, the underground, in order to just to survive. And Germany also sent out submarines and destroyed Allied shipping lines. They pretty much controlled the Atlantic in the beginning of the war. So things were not going very well at all. So this map, I think, is really a great way of just presenting how bad the war was going for the Allies in the beginning. So this is a map of Europe in 1941, and everywhere you see that is gray or black is under the control of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. But as I had said before, Mussolini was really the junior partner in this relationship. So let's just state the obvious. It's all under the control of Nazis and Hitler. And you can imagine that if you're in the United Kingdom right now, that lone country on the edge of Europe that's not been taken over by the Nazis, you are genuinely terrified at this point. Things are not going well. So this is where the two wars that I've described, the war in Asia and the war in Europe, are going to join up together, and it's going to turn into a world war. And it happens because Japan and Germany form an alliance. So why would they do this? Well, it's because they both see a common enemy. Although Germany had formed that secret agreement with the Soviet Union, Hitler knew that sooner or later he was going to have to deal with Stalin. That Stalin was not just going to sit idly by as Germany solidified its position across all of Western Europe, because that would be a long-term threat to Joseph Stalin. And so he knew that eventually the Soviet Union was going to turn on him. So he took preparations to make sure that he was going to make it as difficult as possible for them. And so one way to do that would be to form an alliance with Japan, because Japan is on the other side of the Soviet Union. Likewise, Japan also sees the Soviet Union as a threat, because as Japan is building up its empire in Asia, it knows that eventually the Soviet Union is going to not like that either, because it would be a threat to them. So both the two countries see the Soviet Union as a threat, and so they make an alliance in 1940. So while Hitler was engaged in his war with the rest of Europe, he continued his internal war against Jewish people. In any of the areas that he occupied, the Jewish people living there faced increasing restrictions in Nazi-occupied Europe. They created ghettos in cities beginning in 1940. So they forced Jewish people from their homes and forced them to congregate and live in these very, very, very small, dense packed urban areas where people were living practically on top of one another, and where disease could run rampant. The conditions in the ghettos were terrible. There often was not enough food, and that was only the beginning of what was going to happen. In the beginning, the Nazis conducted a policy where they wanted to encourage emigration. They wanted to encourage Jewish people to leave Nazi-occupied area. However, from 1940 onward, this changed from a policy of emigration to extermination. And essentially, the doors were shut from that point onward, and the Nazis focused just on killing Jewish people. From 1941 onward, the Nazis utilized death squads and pogroms. Pogroms are basically where they would give carte blanche to private citizens to essentially create lynching gangs, which could go around and kill Jewish people without any fear of censure. So in the late 1930s, Jewish people were desperately trying to get out of Europe before those doors shut. One horribly shameful example in Canadian history is when the German transatlantic liner St. Louis arrived in Canada in 1939. On board the St. Louis were 900 Jewish refugees who were seeking sanctuary from Nazi Germany. Canada, under the direction of the Prime Minister Mackenzie King, turned them away. They were also refused entry into the United States. The ship was forced to return to occupied Europe. Nearly half of the people on that ship would ultimately die in the Holocaust, which is just an incredibly sad and shameful part of our country's history, that we turned them away in that time of need. You know, generally speaking, quite a bit of the anti-Semitism and the laws against Jewish people were widely supported by German people. There were, movements to boycott Jewish stores. So here's a picture of a sign used during an anti-Jewish boycott, and it says, "Help Germany from Jewish capital. Don't buy in Jewish stores." And this is from 1933, in the lead up to the war. Obviously, things would get a lot worse for Jewish people over time. In the beginning, it started just as a widespread state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and eventually Jewish people are forced to identify themselves using Stars of David and are forced to move into ghettos. So the deportation of Jews to extermination camps began about a month after the introduction of the Star badges, the Star of David badges, which Jews were required to wear in occupied Europe. The death camps and the concentration camps would take the Holocaust to a whole new level. So what the Nazis called the final solution began in earnest in 1942. No longer were Jews allowed to leave occupied Europe. From now on, the Nazis would concentrate on murdering them. The emergence of death camps were essentially factories of death. They were designed to kill massive amounts of people in the most efficient way possible. One of those death camps was the Auschwitz concentration camp, and you see Jewish people in this picture arriving at the camp in May of 1944. Most people would be dead within hours after arriving on trains in the camp. The only people who would be spared even for a short period of time would be young, healthy men, and only because they needed the labor to dispose of bodies. Women and children and old people were killed within just a few hours of arriving at the camp. They used gas chambers in order to efficiently murder as many people as possible. They had crematoria set up to burn the bodies. All of this was designed to depersonalize killing on a mass scale. This was the bureaucratized and government-sanctioned murder of over 6 million Jewish people. So eventually things turn around. 1941 is the year that it happens, the turning point in the war. And there's two major events which turn the tide against the Axis powers, against Germany, Italy, and Japan. The first major event is a complete strategic misstep by Hitler. He decides to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Now, if you recall from this course, we've talked about this already. Generally speaking, in history, it is a very, very bad idea to invade Russia, as Napoleon found out a century earlier. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they faced incredibly fierce resistance. Soviet Union is a very large place. They also had to traverse this huge country. The Russians followed the same strategy they always had, which is to withdraw, let the troops come in, and then attack fiercely once winter comes, and Germany was not well equipped for winter. So you might wonder, why on earth did Hitler make this mistake? Partially it was because he felt that war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, that sooner or later Stalin was going to attack him because he had so much success in Western Europe that this just proved to be too much of a threat for Stalin, and that war was going to come one way or another, and Hitler would prefer to choose it on his own terms. The other is a little bit of hubris, no doubt. Hitler had great success that far in the war, and he really thought that his success would continue. It didn't. The invasion of the Soviet Union turned out to be a disaster. The German army was essentially stuck at Stalingrad, where there was fierce fighting for over a year. There you see a Russian soldier, waving the red banner over the central plaza of Stalingrad in 1943. So the Soviet invasion not going very well at all. A similar strategic misstep was made by the Japanese, and we'll see that next. So just a few months after Germany invades Russia, Japan decides to attack the United States, bringing the United States into the war. Now, why did Japan do this? So as Japan, like Germany, had lots of success and was expanding in Asia and into the Pacific, they felt that sooner or later America was going to go to war against them, that America would not let them continue to gobble up all of these territories in the Pacific because it was going to butt up against American interests. And perhaps they were right, but the truth is that at that point in time there was little appetite for war within the United States. Like the First World War, there was generally an isolationist vibe in the air, so to speak. However, Japan completely misjudged what the reaction would be to the bombing of the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japan believed that if it could strike a decisive blow against the Americans by bombing their main naval base, that it would so demoralize the Americans that they would sue for peace immediately, and they would, with their tail between their legs, back off and allow Japan to keep all of their possessions in the Pacific. Well, that is obviously not what happened at all. All at once, he unified the country, and America was able to turn its industrial might. And I say industrial might because at this point in time, America really had already begun its path to becoming a superpower. And when America turns all of its factories onto the war effort, and remember, it had also sat out the war up until this point, so its soldiers were fresh. It was a major turning point in the war. So for Germany, Japan, and Italy, things were now going to take a turn for the worse. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was, in retrospect, a complete strategic blunder on the part of the Japanese. So all at once now, there was the Soviet Union on one side of Japan, on the other side they had the United States of America, and in Europe, now Germany had to contend with a war on two fronts. They had the Soviet Union on one side, and then they had the looming likely reinvasion of Europe that was almost certainly going to come on the coast somewhere of France. Where? Nobody knew, but it was going to come. So although 1941 was a turning point in the war, things had not yet turned around for the Allied side in the summer of 1942. At that point in time, the German armies were deep into Russia, and continental Europe was still under the control of Adolf Hitler. I want to turn now to one battle in particular, only because it's very important for Canadian history, but it also was an important moment on the slow preparations to take back continental Europe from the Nazis. This was the raid at Dieppe, which for Canadian historians is often referred to as the disaster at Dieppe because of the great cost that Canadian soldiers paid. The raid at Dieppe, which was planned for August of 1942, was meant to be a testing ground for the Allies to gain a foothold in order to launch later a full-scale invasion of continental Europe. There were approximately 6,000 soldiers involved in the raid, but 5,000 of them were Canadian. And the raid, well, it went as terrible as it could go. Out of the 5,000 Canadian soldiers who participated, 3,500 approximately were killed, captured, or wounded. Less than half of the soldiers that actually landed on the beach of Dieppe actually were able to return back to England. There was a lot of reasons why the raid didn't go well. There was poor planning, strong defenses on the German side, and the conditions of the Pebble Beach made it particularly difficult to move. As you can see, vehicles got stuck in the beach. Canadian politicians back home had been eager to see Canadian soldiers play a role, and thus Canadians played an outsized role in the attack. There was about 5,000 Canadians, only about 1,000 Brits, and perhaps maybe 50 or so Americans that were involved in the raid. Now, obviously, it was a failure, but much of what was learned as a result of that raid would play a role in planning for the much larger D-Day invasion, which would take place 2 years later. And had the Dieppe raid not taken place, the D-Day invasion would not perhaps have been as successful as it ultimately was. So for Canadians, though, it was still a disaster, and we paid a heavy price. Like the First World War, the Canadian government, using the powers of the War Measures Act, made some extraordinary measures to control what they thought were enemies at home. Sadly, this resulted in one of the, again, more shameful episodes of Canadian history. In 1942, the Canadian government suspended civil liberties for Japanese Canadians, so Canadians of Japanese descent. They forced whole families to move into camps, essentially, where they were held for the duration of the war because the government did not believe their loyalty. It wasn't just Japanese. Anti-war dissidents and communists were also interned. Germans, Italians, people of descent from that region also faced hostility and sometimes internment in camps as well. In an earlier slide, I talked about how the Canadian government had turned away a ship filled with German refugees fleeing from the Nazi policies in Europe, and many of the people aboard that ship ultimately perished during the Holocaust. Once we get well into the 1940s, many Jewish refugees did manage to make it into Canada, but if they were of German descent, they also too were forced into internment camps. Approximately 2,300 Jewish men of German and Austrian origin were forced to live in internment camps in Quebec and the Maritimes. All of this was the government's attempt to try to control what was seen as the enemy within, the enemy at home. So after 1943, we are entering into the final stages of the war. On June 6, 1944, the long-awaited and anticipated Allied D-Day invasion of Normandy began. D-Day was the largest sea-borne invasion in history. The operation began the liberation of German-occupied France and later Western Europe, and it laid the foundations for the Allied victory on the Western Front. Between 1944 and 1945, Germany found itself slowly surrounded. On one side, it had Britain and Canada and other Commonwealth countries, the United States invading, and on the other side, it had the Soviet Union. In April of 1945, with Soviet troops at the doorstep of his bunker in Berlin, Hitler committed suicide along with his mistress Eva Braun. A month later, Germany surrendered in May of 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. However, the war in the Pacific continued on for some time. So throughout the latter stages of the war, the United States had been secretly working on a project that was dubbed the Manhattan Project, and it was a collective effort of many different scientists to develop the very first nuclear weapon. The Pacific War was not going very well. Although the United States was slowly pushing the Japanese back, going island to island, the Japanese were not likely going to surrender. A decision was made by the President of the United States, which remains controversial to this day, to use the very first nuclear weapons in warfare, and in fact the only times that nuclear weapons have ever been used in warfare. An atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and this finally resulted in the Japanese surrendering. World War II was finally over. So in 1945, the deadliest conflict in the history of the human race had finally come to a conclusion. And yet, just as it was ending, a new conflict was beginning, and this would be a very different one. The so-called Cold War would see the world divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, towards the end of the war, most people knew that this conflict was likely coming. Although the Soviet Union and the United States were on the same side, both saw that the destruction of Germany and Japan was inevitable. What came next was what was on everyone's mind. Although the United States was the first country to develop nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union was not far behind them, and within a couple of years after the end of World War II, they tested their own nuclear weapons. And this would begin a nuclear arms race between the two countries. Really, what we see is competing world ideologies, a form of communism versus capitalism. The entire world was essentially divided between their two spheres of influence. On one side, we had the liberal democracies led by the United States. On the other side, we saw Soviet communism. A so-called Iron Curtain descended across Europe. That's what Winston Churchill called it. And on one side of the Iron Curtain were all of the Soviet countries that had been gobbled up during World War II as the Soviet Union had pushed Germany back. The dividing line really fell within Germany itself. Germany was divided up between the two victoring powers. And so on one side we had West Germany, which would be under the control of the Western powers. And Western Germany would join that alliance of Western powers and join NATO, which would be the alliance between them. On the other side would be the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, all of the Soviet countries. Now, because the two powers couldn't directly fight one another, and the obvious reason why they couldn't fight one another is because to do so would end the world as we know it. It would be a nuclear war, and a nuclear war would destroy the entire planet. And so the war never could get hot, which is why they called it a Cold War. Instead, the Cold War was fought through proxies and satellite or friendly states. That means that since the Soviet Union and the United States couldn't fight directly, they fought through others. So one example of where the Cold War becomes hot is in the Korean War. So in the 1950s, there was a civil war in Korea. On one side of the conflict was a communist north, which was supported by the Soviet Union, and the southern part of Korea was supported by the United States. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate, and in fact, that division is still there today between North and South Korea. A similar conflict is the Vietnam War, in which, again, a civil war broke out in the country of Vietnam. One side was communist, the other side was capitalist. The Americans fought on the capitalist side. Now, as a rule, whenever one of the two superpowers directly gets involved in a conflict, which the Americans did in Vietnam, the other side can't get involved. So just as in Korea and in Vietnam, the Americans actually fought, the Soviet Union stayed out. And instead, what the Soviet Union did is they supplied and supported the other side. However, the Soviet Union occasionally got directly involved too, and America stayed out. So the war in Afghanistan would see another civil conflict, and in this case, Soviet troops directly got involved in that conflict, and instead, America and NATO stayed out, but they supported the capitalist side in that conflict with money and resources. So the Cold War would last all the way up until the end of the 1980s, when finally the Soviet Union would collapse for a variety of reasons, and the Berlin Wall, which separated East Berlin from West Berlin, which you see in the picture here, would eventually come down, Germany would be reunited, and the Cold War would end. And this brings us to the end of the course. So that's World War II. In our next lecture podcast, we're going to be looking at post-war Canada, and we're going to be covering several major themes, including the overall demobilization and post-war reconstruction that Canada was a part of and other Western countries. We're also going to take a good look at the beginning of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the USSR, which would really last for most of the rest of the 20th century, and of course Canada would ultimately play an active role in being a close ally of the United States. We'll also see the relationship between the government, the people, and the economy fundamentally change with the growth of the welfare state in something that we call the post-war liberal consensus, something that happened in Canada, also the United States, also Britain, a theme that really was going on throughout the Western world. We're also going to see Canada's status on the world stage completely change. We'll see the growth of the Canadian economy, and we'll see during this period Canada grow to become really an economic and technological power. So for example, here you see in 1962 Canada becoming only the third country in the world after Russia and the United States to have a satellite in space. All that to come on the next lecture podcast in Canadian history.